race and mass incarceration and inequality in the United States. All of us kind of felt pretty inspired coming out of that class to plug into what was happening in the community in terms of decarceration work, in general carceral justice. So we're coming up on roughly like our 3-year anniversary of being an organization on this campus, which is pretty cool. And so our main focus right now is plugging into the community, being at an institution of higher learning, and being able to educate the community on different issues related to abolitionism, and how you can get involved in creating safer communities, more just communities, and a much more equitable and just criminal justice system. Not necessarily just in Cuyahoga County, even though that's our focus, but even more broadly, take some of this information with you and plug in elsewhere. So that's a little bit about us. We're RAP, and we just like to say thank you all for being here tonight.
I'm here for us to make space to extend RAP's collective gratitude to our co-sponsors for this event. Crew's Sociology Department, Crew's Social Justice Institute, also known as SJI. There's a sign-up sheet in the front for their newsletter. And the organization Students for Justice in Palestine, also known as SJP, amidst an unjust suspension by university administration and the escalation of Israel's genocide in Gaza, Palestine, the solidarity that SJP extends to our abolitionist pursuits means to us the materialization of our hope toward liberation. So thank you to SJP and to SJI and the Sociology Department.
All right, so I'm just going to introduce our first speaker. We have Amani Sawari, and just a little blurb. Amani pursues abolitionist work through many avenues, through media, music, writing, and community leadership. She is also coordinating the Right to Vote campaign, which publishes and distributes informative media to incarcerated subscribers about their rights and related legislative initiatives. So, go ahead, Amani.
Thank you so much. Thank you all for your time, and I just want to thank the RAP students for organizing this event. Thank you to the sponsors, and thank you so much, Professor Tibb, for inviting me to come out. This is really exciting, and it's wonderful to see so many of you here today. So I was asked to talk about my journey to the abolitionist movement. So I'm going to go over how I came into this work and also where I see the work heading, where I see the movement heading, and how I'm contributing to the movement at this time. All right, so this is me. My organization is called Sawari Media. I create media for incarcerated citizens. Sawari is my given name that I gave myself when I was a college student, when I was in your shoes, just 6 mighty years ago. I started working in criminal justice transformation. I like to call it transformation instead of reform because, as Assata Shakur says, you cannot reform hell, and we're trying to transform this system and create something new out of the foundation and what we have today. I earned my bachelor's at the University of Washington in Seattle, and currently the Prisonality magazine, which I'll tell you all more about, circulates 250-some prisons across 33 states, including Ohio. So I created a little involvement timeline. My involvement started off with academic activities. So it really started in the same place that you all are in right now. I got engaged in student media. I was a part of student radio. I was a part of orientation and transition programs. And during my time as a student was when the Black Lives Matter movement was taking off. So during 2015 and 2016 is when I was in the tail end of my college career. And during that time is when I was actually working as an RA. How many of you all, work on campus? You all have an opportunity to touch other students and other peers. And there's a lot of student workers in this campus. So at that time, I was an RA, and I was tasked with having to create events for my students to participate in who were in my unit. And at the time, Alton Sterling had been murdered. And so I organized my students to go to a rally that was happening in downtown Seattle. And I took some photos. I also do photography in addition to music and poetry and media and all the things. I am an artist. As I was telling Fred, I'm an Aquarius, so that might tell you something about me as well. But during that time, I took some photos and I actually wrote an article online about the Alton Sterling death and the significance of what that meant for me as a citizen with July 4th approaching as Independence Day. And an incarcerated citizen reached out to me. He was incarcerated in Alabama's Department of Corrections, and he reached out to me on Twitter using a contraband cell phone. And so he asked me, first he said, I loved your article, I love your writing style, and I'd love to invite you to participate in our 2018 National Prison Strike. So that takes me into an actual invite to make an impact. I just put my words out into the universe and it boomeranged back to me. So an incarcerated citizen reached out to me. He asked if I would be willing to publish 10 demands that they had for the National Prison Strike. Who's familiar with the 2018 National Prison Strike? Awesome. So now you're about to be, if you're not already. It was the largest demonstration of incarcerated citizens in history, in United States history. And not only did it include 17 states where incarcerated citizens participated in a series of actions, which included boycotting. They boycotted commissary, they boycotted talking on the phone. They did not spend any money in prison for the 2 weeks, which was August the 21st through September the 9th. They also did hunger strikes. They also did work strikes, and they also did sit-ins. And so regardless of if you had a job, if you had the privilege of working, or if you had money to use in commissary, or if you were in general population, if you didn't have access to general population and you couldn't do a sit-in the day room, you could always interact by participating in a hunger strike. And so people were able to participate at all levels, regardless of where they were at in the system. And that is why the 2018 National Prison Strike was so successful. And in addition to those actions, there were also over 350 outside organizations, nonprofits, businesses, candidates for office that signed on to the strike, endorsed this prison strike, and listed those demands on their website or in their physical spaces. So it was able to reach a very wide audience. And then that takes me into the third phase of my involvement, which I just called community preservation. So the National Prison Strike came and went, and I did not want the momentum that had built and the community that had came together across state lines behind the wall to just dissolve as a result of the strike ending. And so I started the Right to Vote report. So at the time, incarcerated citizens had launched their own communications, and they asked me to become the editor of No Shackles newsletter. That newsletter quickly was identified by prison officials and staff as a threat to security. And so that had to be reframed. And so the Right to Vote report came out of the 10th demand of the National Prison Strike, which called for voting rights for not only incarcerated citizens, but also people on probation and parole that had completed their sentences. There were several states, which actually today we've seen a lot of movement in that area. We've seen voting rights restored for parolees and probationers in New Jersey following the strike, in New Mexico following the strike, in California following the strike. So incarcerated citizens started this movement, and they were able to make a lot of headway as a result. And so today, what does the work look like? Today, for me, so Sawari Media LLC is the business that I started to host these publications. So the Right to Vote report was also identified as a threat to security, but in Texas only, so we're making some headway. So Texas is like, oh, this Right to Vote report is educating too many folks. And in the Right to Vote report, we not only published the National Prison Strike demands in the newsletter, but we also published poetry by incarcerated citizens and identified different pieces of legislation that incarcerated citizens would feel related to their cause, so that they could organize around those pieces of legislation that they felt compelled by.
And so Sawari Media LLC was actually established in 2019 in order to house these publications. I started sawarime.org to continue to put out articles that didn't fit into the newsletter. The Right to Vote report was only 8 pages at the time. And currently, the Right to Vote report, since it had to be rebranded again, is now Prisonality magazine. And so if you go to prisonality.org or sawarimedia.press, you'll be able to see the magazine. And go through and flip through those pages. But that platform is even larger. So I went from an 8-page newsletter to a 20-page magazine that not only has the Right to Vote column, which still has pieces of legislation that people who are incarcerated can feel compelled by, but it also has a table that includes every single facility that the report goes out to. And it has a chart that shows the representative, the federal representative who has jurisdiction over that facility, so that incarcerated citizens can act as constituents to their legislators, because they are, and write that legislator about whatever piece of legislation in the magazine they feel compelled by, or maybe it's not a piece of legislation, maybe they want to write about their conditions. My intent and my focus is to ensure that incarcerated citizens, and that does take me into the strategy, understand that they are valued as constituents to their legislators, and that they can act and advocate on behalf of themselves until they have the right to vote. So the final goal is voting rights, but before we get there, we need to ensure that we can close that gap by establishing a dialogue between legislators and their constituents who are incarcerated. And so this is the strategy, increase the engagement to fuel prison abolition. So really the end goal is to abolish prisons, and I think that we can do that through civic engagement of incarcerated citizens. And so there are 2 prongs to that. First, there's community activation. And so I've been publishing print media for incarcerated citizens for the past 7 years. And through that print media, establishing a legislative dialogue between legislators, but also creating relationships with legislators who actually have a heart for what's going on in their communities. I believe that if we raise the bar for how we treat incarcerated citizens, then we're raising the bar for everyone. And when we recognize offices that actually take on the task of upholding incarcerated citizens' values and upholding and humanizing their requests and their demands and their needs, then we can trust that legislator to do that for us on the outside. And we've seen this directly in different offices. Just as an example, I had a meeting with Cory Booker's office staff, and they let me know that when an incarcerated citizen wrote them about kosher meals that they weren't receiving, that they called that facility and asked about why the kosher meals weren't being received. And they said there was a backup in the order, but suddenly the kosher meals were being provided as a result of that. So we can see that when we establish that dialogue and we close that gap between incarcerated citizens and their legislators, that we can actually see progress in how those citizens are being humanized. And then on the other side, we've got mass education. So there's an inside strategy and an outside strategy. Prisonality magazine is free for incarcerated citizens. It's funded through different grant awards that I apply for. And so when it comes to outside mass education, I create a lot of digital resources that'll come out of that magazine, just educating people, and then also participating in different coalitions. One coalition is the National Voting in Prison Coalition, which is hosted by the Sentencing Project. But there are other coalitions like the Voting in Jail Coalition. There are incarcerated citizens who are eligible to vote, who should be voting by absentee ballot, but because there's no legislation to mandate that jail staff do this work, they don't do it. And the reason why they don't do it is because they say, we don't know who's eligible to vote. Okay, then put the registration forms out. Put the eligibility requirements out. They still don't do that. So we work with different partners and community partners and jail partners even. There's actually a jail in Genesee County, Flint, Michigan, that hosts debates between, they hosted a debate with the judges. Supreme Court judges came in as well as local judges to talk to the jailed citizens and let them know about the different initiatives. And when they come in, you can tell the stark contrast between people who know how to talk to marginalized communities and people who don't. And so that really highlights for us on the outside who we should be voting for. So I think it's really important that we bridge those gaps because it services us all. All right, so I'm going to talk a little bit more about prisonality
Personality because it's very new. I launched it in November of last year. That's when I took the Right to Vote report and expanded it into a full-size magazine. And I did that because there were more things that needed to be talked about. We couldn't fit in a 4-page chart into the Right to Vote report. I wanted to put in more poetry by incarcerated citizens, more articles by them, more artwork by them, and just really consolidate the community that had been built over the years and put out more media and press. And so there's two methods to the madness. First, we have personality.org, which I just started doing this, is making the magazine, the print version, available to people on the outside. So if people on the outside want to subscribe to the magazine and actually have a print copy mailed to them, now that is an option. Now there's always the free online option, but there's something about having those pieces of paper in your hand. And then when you have someone, a loved one on the inside, you can also sign them up, and then you guys both have the magazine in your hands, and you can discuss that over the phone and organize. So that's one thing that I put out just recently. And then there's the mobile app. So I'm currently working with an app developer to create Personality as a mobile app where people can actually go in and see different archived content from over the years, including letters from people who participated in the strike and what was going on while they were hunger striking, from California to South Carolina to New Jersey. So I'm building out this platform. It started off as an interactive map, which is still available on sawarimedia.press. But I'm building it out into more of an app. So that is how the movement is developing and what I do today. And this is how the work is, what the direction is going in. So that's what personality.org looks like. And then this is what the app could look like, would look like, just to give you guys an idea of where the work is moving and how things are developing. All right, and so I broke this up into different sections, just talking about where I think the work is headed and what direction I think the actions that are happening today are taking the movement towards abolition. Starting with strengthening the relationships between impacted people and their legislators as constituents. So I spoke on this, but we want to increase divestments from human warehousing. We've heard about divesting from the police. Divesting from the carceral system is an even larger piece of that fits under the umbrella of. We shouldn't be investing in human warehousing, which is what I like to call it because that's what it is. It's not a school, it's not an institution where people are actually being fueled or energized. Facilities are where people who have trauma all these intersecting traumas are being kept because they lacked resources on the outside. They participated in behaviors that were defined as crimes by their local government, and then they were funneled into a human warehouse where they lost access to all of their resources, but are now expected to have different behavior. And so we need to really reshape that narrative and divest from the entire carceral system entirely. Underneath that, and that's where I think the movement is heading. Through connecting legislators with the constituents on the inside, we can see divestments from those systems, just through educating them on what's going on. Next, restoration of impacted people's voting rights. From folks who are on parole to probation to incarcerated citizens themselves. I think that as we begin to fight for the restoration of voting rights for impacted citizens on both sides of the wall, we'll be able to see more folks be civically engaged on both sides of the wall. For example, in New Mexico, we fought for incarcerated citizens to get their voting rights, and that bill was whittled down to probationers, and that's okay, that's still a win. But had we not asked for incarcerated citizens, would we have even got the probationers? I don't think so. So really raising the bar for the most marginalized of our community will help raise the bar for everyone. And now there's still legislation to fight for those incarcerated citizens themselves, and there's coalitions being built around doing that on a federal level. There's actually a federal bill right now that's been introduced by Representative Ayanna Pressley, who's in Massachusetts, as well as Representative Peter Welch, who's in Vermont, which actually where incarcerated citizens have the right to vote. In both Vermont and Maine, people who are in prison do not lose their voting rights. And so Those two legislators are both Democrats, but their federal legislators have introduced the Federal Inclusive Democracy Act, which would restore voting rights to all incarcerated citizens nationwide, but only for federal elections. So they'd be able to vote for their federal representatives and the president. And while that doesn't make an impact on a local level, it does make a huge impact on a national level, and it actually pushes the bar forward to advocate for restored voting rights on a local level and on a state level as well. And that's where I think the work is headed, through that federal legislation. And then up at the top where we see the C, closing facilities that don't meet human rights standards. So we've already seen a lot of private prisons being closed. There's this change in the narrative of what is actually a standard for what people who are incarcerated should be living in. Beginning with private prisons and extending to juvenile and even women's facilities. There's currently discussions around there shouldn't be women who are incarcerated. There shouldn't be children who are in cages. In juvenile detentions, there should be schools. There should be other programs coming in, other sorts of recreations coming in. There should be alternatives for women who are mothers, for women who have children who are in schools. So these conversations are coming about how to humanize the carceral system, but I don't think the carceral system can be humanized. So the more that we push and agitate what is actually a humane environment, the more we'll begin to see the carceral system peel back and expose themselves. I was just made aware of a new jail that's being built in the area. And this is the exact same thing that happened when I was in Seattle. There was a juvenile jail that I would go into to teach poetry every week. And right next door to the jail, they were building a new youth jail. There was a huge movement around not building a new youth jail, so they renamed the youth jail a family justice center. And then people were satisfied. They're like, oh, okay, it's not a jail anymore, but it still had cells in it. It still had judges. It still had bars. It still was a mandated place where people didn't have a window to look out at night. So the renaming of facilities is not enough, and we really need to interrogate what's in the facility, what's being offered, the programs that are there, and if people really have freedoms to learn, to have access to resources, to have access to nutritious foods, that is how we define what's actually humane. Not the name, or how sparkly it is on the outside, or how clean the sidewalk looks on the outside, or even what the artwork looks like. We need to really interrogate that, and the